streaming. It is live. Is it live? It says live. It says in stream. They changed this whole dashboard. Oh.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
You're in violation of secure communication procedures, Commodore.
So we just went ahead and fixed the glitch.
There is no America. There is no democracy.
Our fifth objective, a new world order.
There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West.
Right-wing conspiracy.
What do you call it when the assassins accuse the assassin?
A new world order.
Thank you for plugging in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
Well, just a second there, Professor. We fixed the glitch.
I'm your host, Professor Thomas Henry Horan.
He reads everything.
Anybody ever just take your breath away? Hello. I can't tell. They have changed everything. There's a viewer. Hi, Allard. Can you see me? Can you hear me? It says I'm live. There's a lag, so I must be live. But it didn't tell me to start stream. I just have an option to end stream. I probably accidentally set it up to auto start. Let me go back and press record. Yeah, that's a lag. Let me try to update this. Okay, good. We're live. That's awesome. Let me get rid of that. Well, I'll get rid of it. I want the chat. Well, I'll just have to get rid of it for now. Let me press record and play the theme, just in case.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
You're in violation of secure communication procedures, Commodore.
So we just went ahead and fixed the glitch.
There is no America. There is no democracy.
Our fifth objective, a new world order.
There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West.
Right-wing conspiracy.
What do you call it when the assassins accuse the assassin?
A new world order.
Thank you for plugging in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
Well, just a second there, Professor. We fixed the glitch.
I'm your host, Professor Thomas Henry Horan.
He reads everything.
Woo! What did I miss? Oh, I forgot. Yeah, I'm rusty. A little rusty. I knew this was too complicated. There we go. How's that? Well, have you remember my hair all turned white and all the dark hair fell off my arms and all gone? Well, it all grew back. So, and I'm fine. So, all we can figure out is it was a side effect for my shingles vaccine and booster. So that's it for that. I have been busy, very busy, taking over the world with AI. It had nothing to do with this. I will show you. It's astounding. To borrow a phrase, it's amazing. It's incredible. It is. It really is. But you won't give a rat's ass. What I have to do now is, what I'm really doing is trying to figure out how to explain to people what the hell it is and why they would want to pay the money to subscribe to it. There is a homeschool version. That's the point. So that's a big thing I've been working on all winter, is getting the homeschool version, and it's incredible. So I will show you that soon, but there's no point in showing it to you now because you won't know what the hell it is or what the hell it's for. And not very many people would. It's revolutionized the industry. It's a culmination of my entire career. In the meantime, I have been doing some part-time research. Now, let me explain what's happening next. Nothing. The private premium website is not going to be streaming video. It is going to be everything else, but I'm going to take the existing PowerPoints I have, the rough drafts. I will clean those up, make them into more coherent chapters, and then those will be one of, like, probably the main asset that's played on the you'll go through the PowerPoint. There's a special PowerPoint player with video clips. It'll have audio narration, or you can set it to autoplay and it will just play just like a video. Or it will stop, and then you'll be able to click inside the presentation and jump to another PowerPoint where I say, remember when Hitler did this, and then it goes to that other you can click it and go to that other PowerPoint. This will take a little more time. But what I will be able to do is no more monthly subscriptions. You'll just buy, what I will probably do for the chumps who wander in off the street, you will buy a lifetime subscription to a topic like John Bonet or Zodiac or Manson or Saddam Hussein for like $50. And everything I put out from now on, you already have access to. You guys, especially you guys, what is it? Are there 7 of you left that are paying right now, which is wonderful? You'll get a promo code for for a lifetime subscription to the whole site. Like $100, $50, something like that. All the buckaroos will get a lifetime subscription to the whole thing, $100. If it ain't worth $100, don't worry about it. I won't do it. YouTube will be, I don't know. If you people want to keep paying for I'm going to preview what's coming up next. All the stuff I hinted around about before and showed you wrong theories about before. The next thing I'm going to do this spring, as best I can, as quick as I can, do some more episodes here that won't have anything whatsoever to do about recent events, stimulating though they may be, but will have everything to do with recent events. For example, for Christians, this is Good Friday. It's good because this is the day Jesus was crucified. Why is that good? Because this is the day that Jesus wiped out the debt record. Everything I showed you before was an attempt to try to square the circle of theology and mythology and culture in the Near East during so-called biblical times and since then. You have seen the difficulty in doing that. There's another way of looking at that material, and it goes like this. It's all about the money. It's all about the money. It's all about the money. The whole thing is all about nothing but the money. So I'm going to dive in right now and just start throwing some background at you, and I will show you in more detail later. When I say it's all about the money and wiping out the debt record, I've been paying all this attention to every book of the Bible except the so-called Pauline so-called epistles. That's because they make no sense of any kind whatsoever. Like they don't belong with the Gospels at all. And Praxe Apostolon, the Acts of the Apostles, the practices of the Apostles, seems to be pretty viciously critical of Paul. Paul is really satirized in that book. But it's only if you read Greek. And then of course there's pseudo-Paul. There may have been, he calls himself Saul and changed his name to Paul. None of it makes any sense, let alone why anybody would give a rat's ass about any of it. But if you look at it from the realistic side, it's all about the money. And when you realize it's all about the money, it all makes perfect sense, and it's all literally true. The Bible is suddenly literally true if you understand it was written by businessmen for businessmen. I will begin to show you this tonight. Well, I'll talk about it a little bit. So I'm going to jump in media res, which is the crucifixion of Jesus. How does that wipe out the debt record, and what am I talking about? I'm talking about the debt record, and I'm talking about wiping it out. I'm talking about a debt jubilee. I'm talking about a tax debt jubilee. The only version of the story that makes any sense whatsoever is to read it as literally true. It is written by business people, lawyers, bankers, merchants, for business people in their language. The New Testament was never written in Aramaic. It wasn't even translated into Aramaic. The New Testament was only ever written in Koine. Koine is a very specific dialect of Greek, which is used only by the transnational merchant class and bureaucrats. It is the lingua franca. It is the official language. It's the official language. And it is for no other purpose than law and finance and business and trade and nothing else. It's for nothing else. It has a very precise dictionary of very precise terms. All right, never mind. Not my collar might have been messed up. I'm a little rusty. That's what it's all about. And Paul claims to have been a Pharisee. He's obviously well educated from the merchant class. His father, he says, I was a tent maker, but that means his father was a tent maker. He may have been a tent maker. I'm going to go into more detail about this later. But the Pauline epistles are not a theological argument per se, the way we're thinking of it, or philosophical musings, in no way, shape, or form. They are not only, remember, they are letters patent. Epistolon was an open letter. Like company, like a message from our founder. Not only intended to be read by other Christians within Christian communities, to be read not only by the general public, which he didn't give a rat's ass about, but read not only by the whole entire merchant class, who then, the transnational commercial class in those days, were known as the Vulpes and the Aranai, the wolves and the spiders. Cicero called them the bloodsuckers, the blood siphons. He was literally right. The distinction between Sadducee and Pharisee is completely crystal clear, understandable, comprehensible, and historically accurate when you realize that that book is about nothing but the money. And even the whole book, the Greek Septuagint, the Ptolemaic propaganda piece called the Septuagint, that version of the law, plus the Pharisees and their prophets, but no Babylonian Talmud, or Jerusalem Talmud, or Mishnah, really. Throw all that out. Plus the New Testament, which is not only, it's not so much an operating and procedures manual for a new corporation as it is the parts of that book which were intended for, not for public consumption, and by public I mean available to the government. When Paul talks about threading the eye of a needle, he's talking about stepping through a legal loophole, literally. He is walking those directives, which are open letters for everyone to read. It's to reassure Roman authorities that what they're doing is totally legal and above board. Not that it's theologically acceptable. Although the only thing had to, and I'll get to this, is it can't be a new religion. The Romans called that a superstition. We would call it a cult. They called it a superstition. We call superstition an old-fashioned superstition. The Romans called newfangled cults, which are dangerous. Oh, they're always dangerous. They called those superstitions. Beyond that, it's pure legalese. Spoiler alert, Paul is threading the needle between Roman tax law on the one hand and Roman banking regulations on the other. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking the Romans didn't pass any banking regulations until after the temple problems of 70 AD and on into the... You're absolutely right. Paul makes no sense writing before 66 AD. He makes perfect sense writing after 70 AD, unless you want to get even more literal about it, and he really is writing in the 40s. And there may be... It's an unrealistic itinerary of his travels. If you telescope that time over a realistic period of time, it could go back to 40, 41, 42. It can. But then a lot of it is after 70. That may also explain why there are two names, both Saul and Paul. We just don't know that for sure, but there is a codex. Let me just find that. It's called Codex 46. This is the oldest book of the Bible. Lectionary 46. It is a complete collection. The bottoms of the pages are torn, but we know what goes there. It's not like the Dead Sea Scrolls where they have two words and they fill everything else in with guesswork. It's not like that. This is it's not a complete Bible. The oldest complete Bibles with Old and New Testaments and other things like the Apocrypha, those are the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, these giant master copies produced around. I've always accused them of being produced around. If the Christians were a primitive group of slaves, there's no way they produced that book in 300, but they could have produced them in 400. If you really want to insist that the Christians were cutting edge in their technology, and I can prove that they were, now all of a sudden you push it back to the early 300s, and that means it's all about the money. It's all about the money. Those are the oldest copies. We have found fragments, and people didn't have reading glasses, so a fragment the size of my hand will have 3 or 4 words on it if you're lucky. And those have been linked to, well, this looks like it comes from the Gospel of John, whatever. The oldest complete, more or less complete codex it's just the universally agreed works of Papyrus 46. Papyrus 46. And I think it's a codex. See, the thing about the codex is you don't need a codex for books of literature, because you read those sequentially. That's sequential access memory. It's tape. Remember the cassette tapes for your Commodore 64 computer? They're sequential access. Random access memory requires a codex. Do I have one? For bookkeeping purposes, you can't go through this book in sequential order looking for Shmuel's tax bill because you'll never find it. You need in a scroll form. You need random access. Shmuel is on page 104 to 105, and boom, you're right there. And okay. The codex was invented for business and no other purpose. Later on, they put literature on it for entertainment. They're pocketbooks. But the original codices are about this big. They're about this size. It's a folio of papyrus. And you put these together and sew them together, and then you trim the edges, and you have a codex, you have a book. Just about this size. This one's called The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. Available on Amazon. You know nothing about the Zodiac Killer. It is Papyrus 46. Ha! Also known as Papyrus Chester Beatty II. See this? This is pretty much this is a complete copy of what we would call the real works of Paul. It's a codex approximately 11 by 6. It's guesstimated that this dates from approximately 175 AD. It could go back that. Second half of the 3rd century. First half of the 3rd century, maybe around 200. There's a recent between 175 225. That matters a lot because I think we're looking at a pretty early generation copy, and I'll tell you why when we get to the full story. It's not only an open letter to the members of his little debt rescue society, it's a justification to those senators who have bought into the program, who now it's not just a justification of existing law. I think if it goes back that far, then Paul is also lobbying the Senate, because after 70 AD, and then after there's a couple more Jewish rebellions, they keep chasing the money further and further east. And they come back to Bar Kokhba. The Romans start enacting very modern, sophisticated banking and tax regulations. And Paul's work is threading that needle. And it's almost like he is showing this to the Romans. He's also lobbying. And I'll just briefly explain what he's doing. Before the temple problems in the 60s, the Roman Republic was just the mafia. It was smash and grab. It was unregulated looting. It was a tax farming system, similar. I think the Persians did a lot of this. And it creates a global financial meltdown. So in response to this, the Romans enact very modern banking and tax regulations, which are indistinguishable from today. Nothing has changed since then. And Paul's New Jerusalem Helping Hand the Helping Hand Acceptance Corporation in New Jerusalem is navigating, and it's a tight window. It's the eye of a needle. And remember, according to the Bible, Paul isn't crucified. The last thing anybody hears or sees of Paul, he's living in Rome. He's been there for a couple of years, and it's happily ever after. He's upper middle class comfort for the rest of his life. That's how the story ends. He has successfully navigated the eye of the needle. How he does this, I'm going to go ahead and just try to explain this in layman's terms. You do this every day. You want this every day. You want a debt jubilee. You want to wipe out the debt record, like student loan debt. You want to wipe out the debt record. This has happened many times down through history. History is not about armies and kings. History is all about the money. I will take you back to 6000 BC. I will show you how it is all about the money. It's one story, and it's not about the Christ. Well, it is about the Christ. I'm going to tell you what that means. It's all about the money. It's all about the money. Paul is setting up a very modern retirement tax shelter for a select group of clients. Where he gets these clients from goes all the way back to the crucifixion of Jesus. I'll even show you what the cross really means. Now, there is some sincere theology and spirituality in this, because in those days, people, the intelligentsia, like us, sit around and make these distinctions between the real and the metaphysical. Nobody else did. This was it. This was the kingdom of God. It just wasn't being run right. So your spiritual debts and your financial debts were the same thing. It's all the same thing. When Jesus talks about treasure that can be eaten up by rust and moths, he's not talking about a metaphor. He's talking about the money, which in those days was the same thing as your spiritual well-being. So what Paul is setting up is a new kind of tax shelter. I'll give you a hint to start with. His Corpus Christi it's not quite a modern joint stock corporation where you buy 100 shares in Apple and you can sell 100 shares in Apple. You put in everything you have, and you don't get a share that you can sell or transfer, but you get cradle to grave security. And it isn't just a nursing home where you barely get fed. They're doing pretty well. They're retiring relatively comfortably. What do they need Paul for? They not only need tax advice under this new raft of regulations, they need to liquidate portfolios of toxic assets. Paul is offering and it's in the beginning it's a Ponzi scheme, but he's using the economies of scale to create a slush fund, a tax-free slush fund made up of liquidated toxic assets from a series of specifically Jewish transnational Jewish banker meltdowns, which he's a veteran of a couple of these. He lives to be an old man, and he lives at the right time. There's it isn't just the crucifixion. There's one date in Matthew which is about 26 AD, 27 AD. The other date is 39 AD, and that corresponds to a meltdown that you've never heard of. But it starts the whole thing. And I think Paul is a veteran of that. Paul is one of the best educated tax and financial lawyers of history. And what he is doing is he's offering people the opportunity to liquidate toxic assets into a tax-sheltered retirement plan. there are strings attached. One of those strings attached is you got to be a Jew. Another string attached is Romans. I know what you're thinking. Well, it's against the law now. You're not supposed to benefit directly from a charity that you've gotten a tax deductible donation to. Well, it was against the law in Roman times too. Paul finds a loophole around that, and it goes like this. First of all, you have to be a Jew. Second of all, you can't profit directly from a charity that you're making tax deductible contributions to. But you're going to do it anyway. Because 3, this is a phony charity. It's not a phony charity. Paul is probably, he's not just a lobbyist, he's kind of a bailout guy. He's kind of, I think Paul is closer to Joe Kennedy Sr. FDR put Joe Kennedy Sr. in charge of the brand new Securities and Exchange Commission. He was the chair of that commission. He wrote the first SEC regulations. And somebody said, why are you putting a fox in charge of the hen house? And Roosevelt said, who else are you going to hire to get chase the foxes out of the hen house? Chase the other foxes out of the hen house. He knows all the tricks. I think Paul not only is a lobbyist, I think he has a lot of influence on the new Roman tax regulations because he's there to fix a problem that the Romans it's burning down the Roman Empire. And Paul can fix this, but he needs cooperation from authorities and judges. Paul isn't just going to the Supreme Court in Rome. He's going to major centers of Romans are starting to take over places like Ephesus and Corinth and Alexandria. And so they need help with that. Paul knows all the transnational banking and financial regulations. Read his books. They're masterpieces. And these are just the ones that are intended for public consumption. But this has to be a genuine charity. They got to really take in the poor. And they got to really feed the old people. And they got to really open hospitals. They got to do this. They have to do well by doing good. And this would appease the Roman authorities because you can't directly benefit from a phony charity like the Clinton Foundation or the Gates Foundation. You gotta launder that money. It has to go through several front companies before it comes back to you. Paul is offering the door through the eye of that needle for not only Jews, but the funny thing is, the people who caused this meltdown are the so-called Sadducees, who called themselves Zadokites, the phony Zadokites, the Ptolemaic Hellenized phony Zadokites. They're the ones who lost the most money in the meltdowns of 39 and 69, 70. They're the ones who most desperately need the bailout. They're the ones who weren't real Jews to begin with. And by the way, the conspiracy theory that crypto Jews have been running the world since the dawn of time, the Jews invented that. Have you read the Bible? It's all over. The Ptolemaic propaganda piece, known as the Septuagint translation of the Torah, or Tanakh, is, David, he was actually a Jew. Solomon, did you know he was actually a Jew? They literally do this. You've read the Bible, right? They invent this conspiracy theory. And Paul is taking the scandal of accusing these Sadducees of putting on Jew face for purposes of making of getting phony tax breaks. And they're doing a lot more than that, and I'll explain. He is suddenly like, that's actually the best Jew to be. Pretending to get circumcised, pretending to wash your hands before you perform surgery or eat dinner. All those things are phony and fake. But the real Judaism, you don't need to do those things. Because remember, the Pharisees were the poor. They didn't have a lot of money to lose in the crash, or they didn't have a lot of toxic assets to liquidate and donate to the company. But the ones who caused the meltdown and who need the bailout are the ones in a position to pass new laws, and now they have a motivation to agree to those laws. Because Paul's version of this mutual benefit society, called the Way, also known as the Helping Hand Acceptance Corporation of New Jerusalem, and that matters a lot. It does matter. What happens at the temple in Jerusalem does matter. I'm going to get to that in a second. Paul is brilliantly, there is no, I can't think of any well, how about William Casey? William Casey was a Wall Street lawyer who went around Wall Street and told all these rich assholes, there's no reason to panic. All you got to do is move your money into offshore tax-free British accounts, and I'll set all that up for you. You just got to read and understand these laws and split these hairs, and he sets this up, and he eventually leads to Lolita Island. That's Bill Casey. Bill Casey doesn't say we need to shoot FDR. Bill Casey says, let's see how we can make a profit off the New Deal tax code. So there's a catch. To get the Jew tax break, you have to be a Jew under Jewish law. And 2, you have to pay the fiscus Judaicus. You have to pay the Jew tax. Because under original Roman law, most of the world, those kind of empires where they're not top all the way down, they're just a big protection racket. You're supposed to govern yourselves locally. You still owe tax because the Romans are going to dip into that temple tax fund. And that's where wiping out the debt record comes in. In the ancient world, temples were banks. And the most important temple at the national capital would end up being the National Reserve Bank of the kingdom. And every king starts bleeding the flock dry. But this becomes a really serious issue, apparently, in Jerusalem. And I'll get to that in more detail. But here's how it was working under the Sadducees. Let's be specific. Let's go to Jerusalem. Or you are a Jewish merchant or banker in a city where cities all over the world would have a Jewish quarter where Jewish law applied. But they didn't call them Jews. They were usually called the keepers of the scales, the money changers. They weren't called money changers. They were just called the keepers of the scales. This is kind of like knowing that you can go anywhere in the world and American Express traveler's checks will be honored or Visa will be honored. You will pay an exchange rate, which will be determined by the company's experts. It's been around since at least 2,000 to 3,000 BC. The Romans call them Jews because here's the Senate, here's the forums and the banks, here's the river, and across the river is a little island and a nub of land right here. You walk across the bridges, across the river. It's another 200 meters to the forums. And you climb up that hill. You get past that's a couple of 100 meters. You got a couple streets of forums. And then a couple of 100 meters up the hill is the Senate. You have the Senate, the markets, and the Jews. And they called this neighborhood, this little island, this little stick of land, they called that Judea. Like we would call it Little Italy or we would call it Chinatown. Chinatown's the perfect example to this very day in San Francisco, New York, Seattle, you name it. Shadow banking, shadow law, like it's a shadow economy and a shadow government with a shadow police force. It was exactly the same, except they are people that we today call Jews. But the Romans called them Jews because they only knew the Judeans, merchants and bankers and craftsmen who lived right across the river. So they would meet, so the Jews could go home to a clean neighborhood across the river, but they would go into town to do business in the marketplaces and the banks, and all the banks were there. Now in Rome, the Roman Imperial Federal Reserve Bank was the Temple of Saturn. At Jerusalem, you can think of it as the transnational the Transnational Merchants Reserve Bank of Jerusalem. The biggest building the world had ever seen. Pyramids aren't buildings, they're solid piles of stone. The biggest building the world had ever seen was the Seleucid Transnational Imperial Reserve Bank of Artemis at Ephesus. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was the biggest building the world had ever seen, and it was by far the biggest bank. In terms of percentage of gross domestic product, the Temple of Artemis International Banking, mainly in Ephesus, may have been the biggest bank of all time. And when I say bank, I don't mean a piggy bank full of copper coins. I mean a vault filled with nothing but books and books and books and books of paper money. Not paper currency like this, like retail level currency. In the ancient world, you used ounces or whatever of silver and gold, and then you had that, and tokens, and those, and then you had like very high quality, reliable coins, and then you had, and for small change and like working class retail transactions, you had salt. You had salt, you had local tokens, and then you had metal coins, and then you had paper money. Real money was paper money. Real money was paper money. This is supposed to be a promise to pay to the bearer, could go to a Federal Reserve Bank and draw out $10 in gold. But it's not gold anymore, it's just $10. And not $10 of the assets that are used, it's just 10 more $1 bills. But the theory behind this is you could go to a Federal Reserve Bank and draw out either $10 worth of gold or $10 worth of opium. You know, they have a year's worth of heroin in Fort Knox, right? It's the only thing they have in Fort Knox. Of assets. This goes back before then. This goes back to the Sumerian Empire, where they used clay paper money to represent quantities of grain, bitumen, and a few other commodities that were stored in government, big government silos. And this was used as money to buy things like gold and silver. So paper money comes before metal money, actually. Don't forget that. But paper money, I'm not talking about retail currency, paper money in terms of letters of credit, collateralized debt obligations, very sophisticated financial instruments, There's a and what these are, like a letter of credit. Dear Wang, please extend to my friend Shmuel the same hospitality and courtesy you would extend to me. This is a letter of credit. If you look up what hospitality and courtesy to friends means in the Tanakh or the Torah, whichever copy you're using, it tells you, lend him as much money as you would lend me, lend him no more. Lend him money to buy the things that I would normally buy. You know, I buy silk and porcelain. You know, I don't buy Chinese opium. You know, I don't buy Japanese tea. You know what I buy. So it's a letter of credit. And a letter of credit is not a check. A letter of credit, and he's not co-signing for the loan. This is very important. Extend to Shmuel the same courtesy and hospitality you extend to me. Not give him mine, do it. But there is an implied promise that I will remit any reasonable, valid debts that Shmuel racks up and skips out on, or he dies, or what. I will remit that debt. I'll pick up that debt. Co-signing is making that promise. It's a formal promise made in advance. If my deadbeat brother-in-law fails to make the payments on this car, I will make them. That's not that's not redeeming the debt. You're not paying it off, but you're taking up the payment. You're taking up the responsibility, but you also are, and common law, okay? The memorandum of understanding is what we today call the Torah or the Tanakh. And this evolves over time. It isn't just created once in Jerusalem. But there is a transnational network of money changers, and the Romans sometimes called them negotiators, international lawyers, and financiers. They're sometimes called negotiators. They're sometimes called the keepers of the scales. They do everything that they do today. They're all interrelated by marriage, and they all then this uniform commercial code governs our daily life as well. There is no distinction between the sacred and the profane. There is no distinction between church and state. There is no distinction between religious business and public business. Now, within this world, they provide predictable terms. If I want to buy tea from China, I'm going to worry about 12 middlemen changing the terms along the way. I said I'll pay 7 talents of silver for 200 tons of tea. And you get your 200 tons of tea and you hand over the 200 talents of silver, and that's it. That's a ridiculous amount of money. But you didn't load the 3 talents of silver onto a wagon and send it to China. You deposited the 3 talents of silver in your local bank, which more often than not would be a temple bank, but there were private banks who were subject to auditing by Roman bank examiners. But there were loan sharks in the underworld, in the cemetaria, in geological formations we call catacombs. There were loan sharks. But you didn't have to go to the Bank of Damascus and draw out 3 talents of silver and haul them across the desert without getting robbed and then deposit them in the bank in Antioch. What you did was, you had a silver certificate, or you had 3 silver. Here's a talent. Boom, boom, boom. Here's 10 talents of silver, 11, 12 talents of silver. I want 300 tons of tea. It's all paper. It was all paper. They would have some hard currency reserves. Well, gold and silver and bronze didn't start out as currency. They start out as commodities, just like grain. But instead of storing grain or mutton or wool, and sometimes they did, and issuing paper money on the strength of those kinds of commodities, they start issuing paper money on reserves of metals, because those don't rust, they don't rot, their value doesn't change over time. Was a ghost trying to strangle me? Where does the debt come from? Where do poor people get into debt? Number one, you needed a patron, a paterfamilias, a master. Whether it was your father, your uncle, your owner, whatever it was, you had someone who was responsible for you, someone who represented you in court, someone who would hire a lawyer for you. They were responsible for your debts. So if a slave got a parking ticket, parking your wagon in front of the barley market for too long and got a ticket, the slave wasn't hauled into court. You were hauled into court, and you weren't hauled into court. What they did was they wrote down the ticket, and then they wrote a copy of the ticket using some kind of greasy crayon. They would write it on the slave's apron or their tunic or whatever for all the public to see. You owe $15 for parking, expired parking meter. They had parking meters. They had parking meters for ships and wagons. In the technologically advanced trading centers, there were parking meters. If you got a parking ticket, your patron, your paterfamilias, had to pay it. And most of these guys were busy merchants, and they had open accounts. So, like in Rome, if you were cited, if you were fined for something, that fine was payable at the Temple of Saturn, at the government window. at the parking ticket window at the Temple of Saturn, which people had used as banks, and which the big one, like the Temple of Saturn in Rome or the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, were used as the state reserve banks. And it becomes a super bank. The Bank of Artemis is a super duper bank. The bank in Corinth is a super bank. In Jerusalem, what makes the Jerusalem bank so special? A couple of things. Jerusalem has become the headquarters for the company policy and procedures manuals. Not the company, let's call it a syndicate. That's what it is, it's a syndicate. And they write the bylaws of the syndicate and maintain the bylaws of the syndicate so everybody's on the same page, which is what the service they provide the world. For example, if you were in Susa and you made a purchase, you would say you wanted to buy a camel. Let's say you went to Aqaba, the market in Aqaba, you want to buy a camel. And you ask the camel dealer, how much is that camel? He says, it's 3 gur. 3 gura. This is 3, that's about 30 bushels of barley. The standard $100 bill or $1,000 bill of the Sumerian paper currency written on clay tablets was a gura of barley. And there were other commodities. But the paper, the clay paper money that you see is valued in 10 bushel units of barley. So you went to Aqaba. Even after Sumer disappears, you go to Aqaba and you say, how much is that camel? And he says, it's 3 guru. And you say, well, how much is that in copper? Well, I don't know. So you go see the keeper of the scales. You go see the mediator. You go see the negotiator. You go see the arbitrator. You agree. You and the camel herder have agreed to terms of service. This marketplace in the Jewish quarter is allowed to operate according to its own laws, which you agree to because at least you know you'll be treated, you get the same treatment. Part of the terms of service are you agree not to sue in local court. You agree that all disputes will be settled in binding private arbitration in the Jewish court. Or it wasn't called Jewish. In Phoenician times, it's the same. I'll show you a copy of a lead. It's a sheet of lead. It's a shipping contract for a cargo of spices and wine. And the terms of that, this is around 800 BC. If you translated it into modern English, German, French, it's the exact same contract that you would sign today to ship bulk freight, Amazon or any of these companies. It's the same. And on the back of the contract in fine print is all the stuff that it's not the shipper's fault, it's your responsibility. That's the service they provide, and they provide bargaining arbitration. And here's the best part. I don't have 3 guru worth of copper coins on me, but I have an account. If you were a busy merchant, you would have accounts, and you might have accounts at several markets, and they would know about it. Your agent would be authorized to sign bills. It's all paper money. It's all paper money. It's just account books and letters of credit and bank drafts and receipts. That's all it is. That's all it was then. And here's where it gets interesting. If you got in a time machine and you went back to ancient Rome, where's the Temple of Saturn in Rome? Is that the one in the middle? So there are 2 big market centers. There was the old Forum Bovarium, the old cattle market. And cattle play a big thing in this. for the last 10,000 years. And then there was, I think that's the temple of. And then there's the Forum of Trajan, which is down closer to the river, because the river was silty and the river was moving away from the riverbank, like rivers very often do. What's that doing there? What was my point? If you went back in time and you grabbed a Roman street sweeper, a shit picker, if you pointed to the Temple of Saturn, you said, how much money you reckon's in there? How much money you think they got in there? He'd look at you like you were an idiot. He'd say, well, ain't no money in there. And you'd say, well, what makes you say that? And he'd say, well, haven't you heard? They're exempt from audits by the bank examiners. No one was allowed to audit the Roman Imperial Central Reserve Bank of Saturn. Yes, which bank? There is only one bank in all of America which is exempt. Well, I mean, you can have a private bank, but, actually, they're subject to being audited. There's only one bank in the entire American empire that is exempt from any outside audit, not even the Holy United Nations, and that is the Federal Reserve Banks of St. Louis, New York, Washington, D.C. You know the drill. They are the only banks which are exempt from outside audit. Now, ask yourself this, a secret that deep. Have you ever been to Fort Knox? Don't fly over it. You're thinking, wow, there must be something really valuable in there to have it under that kind of guard. What they're guarding is the nothingness that's in there. Well, look, here. This is one worthless paper dollar. This one has, if you take a 1 and you put some nothing next to it, do you see that 0? That is literally nothing. If you add nothing to a 1, you get 10 of these. And if you add some more nothing to it, you get 100 of these. The more nothing you add to this nothing, the more nothing you get. That is not a solipsism, that's not a sophism. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is not magic with numbers. The more nothing you add to this piece of toilet paper, the more nothing it is worth. Don't you get it? I'm not exaggerating. This is not an anachronism. In a place like Jerusalem, which really has their own laws, how does the state raise money? Well, this is even true in Rome. The general consensus in the world, the cosmology operating in the world at that time was, you owed God or the gods a debt of blood for your life, which is, blood is the life force. So you owed blood. And in most temple cults, you had to bring a sacrifice, that was free of blemishes, blah, 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 blah. Just about the beginning of the Iron Age, this is right around 700 BC, King Hezekiah, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, whatever you want to call it. They consolidate all the little local folk temples where you don't have to have a priest make your sacrifices for you. They consolidate them into big city-state national temples where you have to make the pilgrimage, and you're not worthy to make the sacrifice. You wouldn't know. You can bring your own goat. You can bring your own doves, and the priest will sacrifice. Here's another thing. When you made your sacrifice yourself in the high places, the natural altars like Moses uses in the desert, they found that altar, by the way. It's not the only one. You knew whether the god accepted your sacrifice or not. The way this worked in the big machine temples was they had a huge hood that was the nostrils of the god. And you made the sacrifice and smoke went up. If it went up the nostrils of the god, the sacrifice was accepted. If it went out the side, the god didn't accept your sacrifice, and you still owed more blood to atone for that sin that you owe for. in Jerusalem in Judaism, you'd either go to hell or whatever. Like this, they're a little fuzzy on what the consequences are. But you owe a debt of blood. It is unrealistic for most people in those days to bring a herd of goats. Like if you're rich, you have to bring like a herd of goats or 10 cows. And then the priest was not going to tell you, oh, this thing has blemishes all over it. I'm not going to waste your money by... He goes and he makes a sacrifice. He comes back and tells you if the God accepted your sacrifice or not, and you got to take his word for it. You don't get to see shit. And this was true in pretty much every temple. Some wealthy Romans had their own temples where they could perform their own sacrifices, because they believed this was real. If the God didn't accept your sacrifice, I suggest you buy one of our doves. We have nothing but... It costs money. If you have it. If you don't have it, you got to borrow money. If you are a slave and you have to atone for your sins and the God didn't accept your sacrifice, your master can't let you walk around in sin, whatever your God is, because that's going to bring shame on... Like, you can't do that. So what they do is they go to their account books. Your paterfamilias, your patron, has a savings account at this temple bank. And if he has a positive balance, they're going to deduct from it what you owe. And if there's no money in there, they're going to add it to his tab. And if he doesn't pay it, among other things, he'll be excommunicated. He won't be able to do business with his neighbors. He's in sin of any kind. That's one consequence. Another consequence is debt slavery and tax debt slavery were very, very real things. If someone remitted your debt, if they redeemed your debt, paid it off, you didn't necessarily owe them anything because there's no debt to pay. If they remitted your debt, if they took over the payments of your debt, you owed them service. And people invested money in this. They would remit your debts and put you to work and keep the wages. Now, the legal limit, common law, this was 7 years. Roman common law, it was 7 years. Prisoners of war, tax debtors. This was, and by this time the Romans are like, this is a primitive, we got to do this. Well, what happens is, remember I told you the Romans made a deal with the Nabateans and the Hasmoneans, not the Hasmoneans. Well, they made a deal with the Hasmoneans, and that kind of backfired on them. So they double-cross the Hasmoneans, and they go over the head to the Nabateans and make a deal with Herod. Before all of this happens, it's Hezekiah who is, and I want to go into more detail about why he does this. He consolidates all the little folk temples into one national temple in Jerusalem. And this is not just a local regional city-state temple, because it's not a very wealthy city. This is the schools where the keepers of the scales, the mediators, those guys, that's where they're trained in their transnational commercial. It's like a uniform commercial code. That's where they get their training. They don't have this written out in books necessarily because they don't want people using it against them. That's where you learn. And by this time, there are a few, this transnational syndicate has a few reserve banks of their own. And for various reasons, the one in Jerusalem becomes the central reserve bank of the entire syndicate. Although it's on very shaky political grounds. But for all those reasons, that's because there have been purges I'm going to talk about in future episodes. And later on, Hezekiah apparently does this in collaboration with the Neo-Babylonians, not in resistance to them. We'll come back to that later. But commerce begins to flow again. There's that, you got two plateaus. You've got coming up from the south. Okay, this is up from Egypt. So this would be between you and me as the Mediterranean. Coming up out of Egypt, there's a plateau, and here's Jerusalem, fortress city up here. There's this really rough canyon, and then there's the Golan Heights that continue to the north. This is the de facto boundary between Egypt and Babylon, between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And right across that gap is where the Romans reach and make friends with the Nabateans. I'll show you all of that. And they take, before that, when Alexander the Great conquers the region, he doesn't, I don't think he goes to Jerusalem, right? He goes to Amman, and he kind of leaves things the way they are, status quo ante. The Ptolemies, when all this breaks up, the Ptolemies put the Tobias family in charge, I think definitely of Amman, east of the Jordan. I don't remember who they put in charge of Jerusalem. Oh, not the Hasmoneans. Does it matter? The point is this. They come up with a new version of the law. And they propagandize this by saying that when the Babylonian captives returned, they found a copy of the law, Hosanna. This is the Zadokite, the phony Zadokites, the phony Sadducees. This is the Septuagint version of the law. They, most importantly, they're not kings, but they are the high priests who run the temple bank. And the reason they institute such a strict interpretation of the law, the Jewish Taliban in Palestine at the time, is because it's a cash grab, and everybody knows it. They got religious police, Sakari, running around the city. That's a sin, that's a sin, that's a sin. And they're writing down the tab on your right. Paul talks about people coming in with debts written on aprons, handkerchiefs, scarves. This is what they did. And your patron was on the hook for this. And this becomes a flagrant, blatant cash grab. And this is blood debt that is redeemed, and they just make it, it's just redeemable in cash. They just cut out all pretense, pretty much. And this is what they're universally criticized for. Well, the Herodians are not only using the cash that these people don't have, but what's really happening is every member of the syndicate from Ireland to China owes a half shekel tax minimum every year. And what's happening is they have these debt ledgers are piling up, very carefully cross-referenced and very studiously maintained. And these are bundled. 12 books for large accounts, 144 books for small accounts. And eventually what this evolves into is these are expectations of future revenue, which will be gathered by the tax, what's that called? The United States government, the Treasury is the tax collector in this country. There's a role. Future revenues by the tax collector, and these are used as collateral to get even more paper loans from the super banks in Ephesus and Corinth and places like that to continue building his infrastructure program, which includes this gaudy new temple, which has all these offices in it. It's no longer a regional, it's now going to be the capital of the entire syndicate, which was known at the time as the spider's web. It was known as it wasn't called the Jewish syndicate. They didn't use the word syndicate, but everybody knew what it was. They were called the wolves. They were called the spiders. It's a spider's web. Cicero, like all their critics. Now, Cicero's criticism is interesting. The point is, the whole world economy is running on this more or less Jewish paper money, which is backed by blood debt at the temple. And the Pharisees are sick of this, and they say, well, the temple is no longer even a valid place to make sacrifices. This is not a spiritual boycott. This is a tax boycott. And this is causing problems. And the Romans are like, they don't get directly involved. It's Herod's problem. But what Hillel the elder, the Sadducee, he's the Paul of the Sadducees. He comes up with a loophole. He doesn't cancel the 7-year tax jubilee. It becomes a tax remission. The state temple bank of Jerusalem becomes the remitter of your sins. You now owe them to the temple bank. And if you don't pay, you can be sold into debt slavery or tax debt slavery if it's a temple debt. They can hire you out as a slave in the fields and get their money that way. Or if you're a highly skilled merchant and lawyer, international lawyer like Paul, you can be forced to go to work. I think Paul got his training in the Sadducee banking industry. I think they sent him to Corinth and Ephesus and places like this to get training. And he's wearing Pharisee face. He's acceptable. Those are all Seleucid areas. Paul doesn't set foot in the Ptolemaic areas or the Nabatean areas. Paul spends his entire career in the Seleucid and Seleucid-friendly Greek areas. And he's at Ephesus for almost 3 years. What's he doing there? Well, he learned all the banking intricacies of Ephesus from someplace. He must have learned it while he was there. I think his father's tent-making business went into bankruptcy. It's like a receivership, but it's at the Temple State Bank. Business goes into receivership. Paul is sold into debt slavery and either he works directly for the temple bank because they need Pharisee, the Seleucids are cool with the Pharisees. They're pretty much the Pharisees believe in the Babylonian Talmud. So the Pharisees are going to run the bank in Jerusalem the way the Seleucids would want it run. The Sadducees are running the bank in Jerusalem the way the Greeks wanted it run, and the Romans are learning to want it run. But if Herod's Temple National Reserve Bank in Jerusalem is going to have access to the loans he needs from the super banks at the cities where he's trying to buy the materials for his gaudy building projects, it would help a lot to send a Pharisee. And the Bank of Artemis was not only employed a lot of clerks, but they had a really cool internship program. You would work there for a year or so and go back to your hometown, and now you're the guy back home who knows how to do business with the super banks back there, and you have the personal connections. And I have a feeling Paul was sold into, because he talks about being bought as a slave from the marketplace, but he doesn't do work in the fields. He's a highly trained, well, for one thing, he can't. And he's smart. He's really smart. And he was trained, his father, he probably was the office manager, the clerk of his father's tent making business. And then he's repossessed, and they say, well, let's send him to Corinth, let's send him to Ephesus and let him, he's a Pharisee, they'll let him in, he'll get trained in how to do all this stuff. And he turns around and bites him in the ass. And when they deserve it. They deserve it. This is one of the biggest ripoffs of all time. And it becomes not just a Ponzi scheme. It becomes a 2008. But everybody's laboring under this tax burden. Now, especially under the Zadokite interpretation of the law, once you've sinned, you owe a debt of blood to God that you can never pay off until you die. Not enough blood, no animal blood, and human sacrifices out the window. What can you do? Under Zadokite law, God can't forgive your debt, even if he wants to, because he'd be breaking his own law. And if God breaks his own law, he's not God anymore. What you need is a remitter who does have the authority to forgive your debt. That's where Jesus comes in. That's the role he plays for Paul. Paul finds a legal loophole. We're still Jews because we're the real Jews, not the phony Zadokite Jews. We're the original Jews. And he convinces them of this. And remember, the Sadducees are letting all these Greek and Roman merchants join the syndicate without having to get circumcised, without having to wash their hands after they go to the bathroom, let alone before they eat or perform surgery or deliver a baby. They're bending the rules for these guys because they need the capital coming in, and they need the business contacts. They need the buyers for what they're selling. They need the sellers for what they're buying. They need the chumps to borrow the money at ludicrous interest rates. What's the solution here? Between Herod and Paul, there's this thing about Jesus redeeming the debt. Not redeeming it. Well, he redeems it later. First, he must remit your debt. He must take your spirit, your blood debt from the temple and take it on himself. Then he can forgive it. Where does he get the spiritual legal authority to do this? I'll let Paul explain that to you. That's what's going on. And it's when he dies that the debt is forgiven, because the debt of blood has now been satisfied by blood that is finally will satisfy the debt of blood. But first he has to remit your debt. That's what it's all about. Now, let me find, if I can find this. When someone, in these ancient account books, they had symbols for transactions. Remember, to remit a debt was to take over the payments, to transfer the debt, it was the lien holder to another lien holder. This is a third party. And again, under the law, your patron was legally and the Zadokites are really just abusing all of these regulations. They're abusing all of them. And your patron is now, and your patron's patron is now liable for these debts that are piling up. There was a symbol in the ledger. Where is it? There may not. There was a symbol for when a debt was paid off and that was redeemed. They think this is all about Christianity. No. Not debt cancellation, not a debt jubilee. A remission of debt. The symbol they put, I've seen this. The symbol for a remitted debt was you'd have a debt entry and the symbol was a cross. And the name of the remitter and the page number of the ledger where his account is kept. Jesus picks up the cross. He remits your debt of blood for your sins, which by this time is payable in cash, and that law is enforced by the Romans at the time. When all this shit hits the fan, I always wondered if the riots were started on purpose, because there's a series of events. People start to wonder how much money is really in those banks and whether there's anything actually backing up the paper money. What had happened to the Sumerian Empire was this. Their paper money, which was used as, big denomination money in banks all over the ancient world. There's we have a record of a bounced check. A governor of a city sends a check, a bank draft, to a regional depository saying, I need 400 bushels of barley. We've had a drought. I need barley. We don't have a copy of the bounced check, but we do have the ledger where his check bounces, other checks bounce. They're getting copies of letters where these checks are bouncing all over the empire. And a week later, the Sumerian, the Akkadian Empire no longer exists. It wasn't a military defeat and it wasn't a plague. everybody realized this paper money was worthless. The clothes had no emperor. There were no assets in any of the Acadian reserve banks. So the banking reform is you switch to something more durable, which is the metals, which have been bartered for these goods for a long time. And these wandering pastoral merchants like Abraham drag the money around with them. They start putting them in more secure, centralized temple banks. Instead of little banks that can be robbed, you get one closely guarded bank. And this becomes a Federal Reserve Bank for the king of the Jews. Speaking of a Jew who's not a Jew, Herod's another king of the Jews who's not a Jew. The Jews have never been ruled by a Jew. That's what it's all about. And Paul goes around saying, we don't owe these temple banks. Private banks would buy these books of temple debt ledgers and try to collect on them. Like collection agencies are not new. None of this is new in the slightest. Well, in 66, the riots start. The city kind of devolves into a civil war. In 68, somebody breaks into the temple vaults and burns all the books. Traditional fairy tales say they burned the religious books. We know they didn't do that. What they burned was the debt ledger. That's when the Romans lose their shit. That's when the Romans try to take over Jerusalem, and Titus kicks the door down to the temple bank, and there's no gold. There's a little bit of gold, but there's no gold. So duplicate copies of the ledgers of all the debt are now worthless because the paper money that was supposed to be backed by the gold and silver and bronze in the vaults of the Jerusalem National Reserve Bank, Temple Bank, aren't there. And the Romans come up with the conspiracy theory. Those filthy spiders must have snuck it out. This goes back to Cicero in 63 BC, who they find out that this Zadokite bank in Rome has done the same thing. It collapses. A lot of Romans have invested in this. They're not supposed to because they're not Jews. They can't sue in court because they've been claiming Jewish tax status that they don't know what to do. And Paul is going around offering these local, zaibatsus, these local cartels, these local Gambino families. He's offering them an opportunity to liquidate some of these toxic paper assets into a new kind of holding company the world has never seen before. And I'm telling you, he navigates that loophole. And the Romans, a lot of Romans are joining this. But then that's why it becomes politically a hot potato. And it starts at Leontopolis and Alexandria in 39. It spreads to Jerusalem in the 60s. It goes from Jerusalem to Kitos. It goes from Kitos back to Jerusalem for Bar Kokhba. These are not the only this is not the only financial meltdown. But this idea that the Christos can remit your sin debt of blood payable in cash to the state temple reserve bank can be remitted by this guy is something that Paul comes up with as a tax dodge. And to get away with calling this a charitable donation, they have to start doing charity. And the last thing we hear from Paul is he's doing very well by doing good. So that's what's coming up on this YouTube channel. You didn't see that yet. I will show you where it all starts. I will show you where it all ends. It all ends right here. But Good Friday, the cross, is literally Jesus, literally remitting, going to that ledger book, St. Peter's ledger book in the sky where your sins are recorded, and St. Peter puts a cross next to your name and the initials JC and page number 0. He has remitted your debt. Now you owe that debt to Jesus. but you want to pay Jesus because Jesus has the power to forgive your debt that God couldn't do without breaking his own law. That's where it gets complicated. But it's not complicated when you realize it's all about the money. Sunday, I'll tell you what Easter Sunday is really all about. I'm Professor Thomas Henry Horan, asking you to please stay plugged in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
He reads everything.
I will show you things. I will show you Kuzma's mother. I'll see you. I'll try to see you Sunday. I'll try to start streaming again. I'm not promising super high quality episodes, but if you keep paying, I'll start making more episodes like this. I've got it all figured out. And then we'll get back to you on the stuff, current events, and that's going to have to be, I'm not even going to test it on YouTube, but you got to see, there's several months of these type of episodes y'all need to see anyway. So thank you. God bless. Enjoy your holiday. And think about this. Think about the concept of a Shia Christian. What I'm looking for is how to stop this stream. There we go. Think about the concept of a Shia Christian. And I'll see you Sunday.